Welcome to the 8th in our series of challenges in forest ecology. Today's speaker is Michael Scherer Lorenzen. He's a professor of geobotany at University of Freiburg. He's had an illustrious career, starting off in Bayreuth, where he did his PhD, and various stops, and pursued a career through Max Planck in Jena and the ETH in Zurich. Like all our speakers, he's an expert in his field, very much a leader in the field of biodiversity and ecosystem function. He has an incredible H index of 86, and his work's been cited over 30,000 times. He's going to talk today about the role of forest biodiversity for human health benefits and risks. So over to you, Michel.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Douglas, and for the invitation to talk to you here today. So just checking my screen. So I hope you can now see the first slide. Okay, good. So as Douglas said, I will talk about the role of forest biodiversity for human health benefits and risks. And actually, this is mainly the results of one project we had together, where Douglas was also involved, the so-called Dr. Forest project, which has been funded within the Biodiversa program of the European Union. And so if we now think in this community here, we all are aware of these multiple global crises. So also in this seminar series, we talked a lot about climate change and biodiversity and how these interact. But in addition to this, we have a third human health problem or crisis, and especially in the global south, but not only there. And of course, human health is also affected by climate change and maybe also by biodiversity. And this has been the basic question of this project. So we know already for some time that if you are in a city and if you then go out to a forest, that this usually has positive health effects. But what we don't know is whether the characteristics of that forest, whether this matters for these health effects. And whether we see a difference in health effects if we compare low diverse green spaces versus high diverse green spaces. And actually this is can be boiled down, will any green space do for these health effects, or does diversity matter? And in this project, we worked along these guiding hypotheses. So first, we suggested that if you have higher biodiversity in forests, you should see an increasing of the restoring and building capacities that actually improve mental and physical health. And we studied psychological restoration and also recreation and forest products. And the second pathway is that increased forest biodiversity could maybe also reducing the harm and the physical illness caused by, for example, allergies, infections, or chronic diseases. And then we worked on disease vectors and particulate matter filtration. And I will show you some of those results today. So the whole experiment or the whole study was done in 5 different countries, and we worked both in semi-natural forests, but also in young plantations. And these plantations belong to the global network of tree diversity experiments, or TreeDivNet. And in all of those cases, both in the natural stands, in the plantations, we always had a gradient of tree species richness or functional diversity at each site. So we worked, for example, in the Białowieża National Park in Poland, but we also worked in these little kind of artificial little forests, like here in the Orphée TreeDivNet experiment in France. We had different measures of forest biodiversity included. So the classical one, like diversity, where we talk about tree species richness, Shannon diversity. But we also worked because of one of our focus on mental health. We also worked on the concept of perceived biodiversity. That's actually the people's subjective experience of biodiversity. What people think the surrounding, how diverse this is. We also looked at structural aspects of forests like stem density, stand density, canopy height, leaf area index, and so on. And we also talked about, we also analyzed the composition of the forest, like deciduous versus conifers or leaf sizes. So if we want, I would like to start with this first work on mental health. And we know that nature experience can have a whole series of positive health effects. And the question is now, if we confront participants with different diverse environmental settings, whether this actually then has an effect on health. So this study included a pre-post design. So participants have been asked to report about their mental health along standardized questionnaires. And then they were split into different groups. So one kind of control group stayed in an urban environment, and the others were then sitting, in low diverse, mid diverse, or high diverse forests. And then there was a post intervention where, again, these different questions were asked. And we had physical, psychological, and also physiological indicators of health and well-being. Just to give you some impression how this looked like. So this, for example, was the pre-intervention, and then people were allocated to those different forest or built environments. So just one example of the outcomes is here you can see on the x-axis these different settings. So the built control environment, and then low, medium, high forest diversity. And here I use this subjective stress indicator, where you can see that if you stay in the built environment for some time, actually your stress level, even in that case, significantly increased a little bit. While if you stay in a forest, then after this only 20 minutes stay in the forest, your subjective stress level decreased significantly. But as you can also see here, there was no significant effect of those different diversity settings. So it was just be in the forest and you're happy, doesn't matter which forest it is. So in general, we had these results not only in mental health, but also mental well-being, perceived stress, and perceived attention. So we had no effect of tree diversity, but as we looked a little bit more closely, for example, by asking the people, how diverse you think is this environment. So now looking at the perceived diversity, we saw a small but still significant effect on attention, perceived stress, restoration, and also positive affect. And this is one of these examples where at the x-axis you have the perceived overall biodiversity, so what people think, how diverse the environment is. And then as the response variable, the perceived restorativeness of a soundscape. So this was used with acoustic cues. And as you can see, there was large scatter, but in the end, a small but significant effect of that diversity on that restorativeness of these acoustic environments. Second point, if we look at thermal comfort and heat stress, we know that forests can reduce that heat stress. And to actually measure and quantify this, one measure is the so-called physiological equivalent temperature that reflects human thermal perception or comfort. And to calculate that, you need information about heat radiation, humidity, air temperature, wind speed. And we measured all these things both in low diverse systems and also in high diverse systems. Now, as a result, we saw actually in cold in cold periods, in cold days, so these are the blue symbols here, we saw that being in a forest actually alleviates coldiness a little bit. So it's actually, you feel a little bit warmer in a forest than outside in the field. And that's something we know and we experience. And we had a large and big effect on moderate and strong and extreme heat. So if the physiological equivalent temperature was between, 25 or even 40 degrees Celsius, then we had these very strong cooling effect of the forest, both in the young plantations where we had a difference of up to 10 degrees PET, or in mature forests, which was under extreme heat even more than 14 degrees Celsius PET, cooler in the forest than outside the forest. So we had these more than 80% less strong and extreme heat stress days if you calculate that over a whole year. Now, if we look at what aspects of forest actually influence this result, so looking at diversity, structure, composition, and so on, we saw actually a strong cooling effect in denser and taller forests. So here, what you can see here is the basal area and the average height of the forest had strong effects, as well as a strong heating in more open forests. So this is the canopy openness, while the diversity here, forest diversity on the left side, had actually a rather low modeled effect on these cooling effects. And also species composition had relatively small effects on these thermal aspects. Now, if we go to another aspect, what we studied was physical health, and this was done at the example of ticks and tick-borne diseases, which is a risk for humans, but also domestic animals. We had the idea that the forest overstory, which can be divided into tree species composition and identity, species richness, or canopy tree density, will then affect the forest microclimate and also the growth of the understory. And both of these things will then affect the abundance and presence of ticks and their pathogens, which then in the end poses these sanitary risks. So if we look at nymph abundance in different tree species compositions, and these are results from the tree diversity experiment in France, in Orphée, you can see at the x-axis different tree species compositions, so monocultures, but also 3 species mixtures and 2 species mixtures. What you can see is that the nymph abundance, so nymphs of the ticks, actually differs quite largely between those different compositions. So there's a kind of a base or background nymph abundance in all these different little patches, but there are some compositions that obviously harbor more ticks than others. Oops. And if you look at the nymph abundance in response to the canopy tree density, you can see that the closer, the denser the forest stand, the more ticks you can find. But of course, the presence of ticks is not the presence of Lyme or the pathogens. So if you want to look at the sanitary risks, you also have to quantify the pathogens in the ticks, and that's what we did. And then what we found is that if you now compare monocultures with 2 and 3 species mixtures and relate that to the proportion of positive nymphs that are affected by the Borrelia pathogen, so the one that causes Lyme disease, we saw a strong and significant decrease with increasing tree species richness. And that was especially pronounced in the non-irrigated plots, so in the very dry plots in southern France, while the irrigated plots, these are more kind of the controls of a normal moist year. And these differences also then relate to the fact that with increasing dryness and climate change, maybe these health-related effects of forest might also change. So this result is one of few that shows, it's kind of safer to walk in more tree species rich forests than in monocultures. But I have to say that there are other studies also in Europe showing the opposite or neutral effect. So this is still a matter of debate whether this can be generalized. And then finally, I want to show results where actually Doug could explain them better to you than I can do. Actually, that was the PhD student of Doug, Matthias Steinpatzer. He actually analyzed the air quality regulation of these different tree diversity settings and actually working on fine particular matter filtration by the tree canopy. So in principle, the particulate matter, let's say the dust in the air, can be filtered out by tree canopies. We know that. And the different abiotic and biotic factors actually influence that particulate matter accumulation potential of the trees and thus the filtering capacity. So this can be, for example, how long the leaves have been dry before the next rain comes, the temperature, wind speed, of course, and also the pollution level, whether it's a low, medium, or high pollution surrounding. And then the trees themselves, of course, also affect this filtering capacity. So based on their leaf habit, for example, broadleaf or conifer leaves, and then more on another scale, you can distinguish between, characteristics of the tree itself, like the crown density and tree height and so on. Also the macrostructure of the leaf, so the total leaf surface area or leaf shape, leaf margins and so on. But also little microstructures like whether leaves have trichomes or a wax layer. These things largely affect these particular matter accumulation. And just one of many results of Matthias, just showing that if you now look at the particular matter of a specific size class, which are removed from leaves per square meter in stand area, then we have in these experiments, different monocultures, different tree species, and then you have, for example, 2 species mixtures and the full mixture of all 4 species that have been present in this experiment. And the first row is these observed values. So what actually has been measured in those different communities. And then you can compare that against the predicted values. So what would you expect based on the monoculture values? And Matthias calculated 2 different predicted values, the nominal, which is based on the species proportions, and the actual, which is based on the leaf area, actually per species in those mixtures. And what you can see in the last column is that actually the filtering capacity, the observed filtering capacity in the mixture is significantly higher than what you would expect, what you would predict. So there is something going on in those canopies. And this is presumably related to the leaf area index in those mixtures. So if you compare the leaf area index, again, between the monocultures, the 2 species mixtures, and the full 4 species mixture, you can see that especially those mixtures have the highest leaf area index. And this could at least partly explain why, for example, in a mixed canopy where you have kind of complementary crown shapes, the filtering capacity is actually in the observed parts higher than what you would predict. Now, if you come now to kind of the synthesis of all this, what we did is that we used the Bayesian belief network model, which has been orientated along this ecosystem service cascade model, so that, coming from a biophysical structure to ecosystem functions, services, and then later the health outcome, that we kind of included all those informations we got from those to then model or building a model for each of those different health outcomes. So from mental well-being to air quality. And if you do that, you end up with these kind of summary graphs. And here, what you can see is that you have different components of the tree community, so tree diversity, different aspects of tree structure, but also of tree composition. And what you generally can see for these different health outcomes we studied, so from the tick-borne disease down here, up to these mental well-being things up here, that usually or just to give you an example, so this is, for example, for the microclimatic buffering, the heat stress study. And if you look at stand density, how stand density affect that heat buffering, we have different aspects. So here, for example, the cooling capacity, which is the ecosystem function. Then we translate that into an ecosystem service, which would be the heat stress reduction. And then we translate that into the health outcome, which could be, for example, heat mortality reduction or that thermal comfort. Just to let you know how these kind of graphs can be interpreted. Now, just to summarize that, what you consistently see a kind of effect size dilution along this causal change in the ecosystem service cascade model, which in the end means that the health outcomes are actually relatively small in comparison to the ecosystem functions or services. So at the individual personal level, we have relatively small health effects seen. But if you think at the population level, if you come from a public health perspective, then these little tiny effects could still add up to substantial public health effects that could generally increase health of a population. And what we also saw is that mostly canopy density, also stand density, and to a lesser extent also tree diversity are the most influential drivers. And overall, what we saw were not all of our study components actually, we saw significant health effects, but still we saw several ones and mostly positive ones. Negative ones are, of course, those related to ticks and tick-borne diseases, but also if we look at the production of medicinal plants, what we also studied, which I haven't shown you here in much details, where tree, in that case, canopy effects had negative effects on the production of these medicinal plants. So another aspect of that synthesis showed that, of course, there are sometimes synergies between those different ecosystem services or health outcomes, but of course also many trade-offs. And for example, if you would manage a forest that is good for the cooling capacity, that would also be beneficial for the particular matter filtration. But the same management to support cooling would negatively trade off with the ticks and tick-borne diseases. So a forest which is good for cooling, so a dense, closed canopy, is actually the one that also harbored more ticks. So there are trade-offs but also in some cases synergies, which means that if we think from a management perspective, that indeed forest management could aid public health aspects and could try to avoid those ecosystem disservices by promoting certain forest characteristics, but of course not always at the same location. So you cannot manage the same forest stand for all these different health outcomes. And of course, then you have to consider the local needs and have to prioritize. So with that, I would like to sum up. So what we found in that project is that forests generate small net health benefits regardless of their ecological characteristics in most cases. So even suboptimal forests are better than no forest, which is kind of trivial. We found that two key forest characteristics are associated with human well-being, which is the diversity, especially the perceived diversity for mental health, and canopy density. And that these human well-being outcomes are often associated with different forest characteristics. So there are these synergies and trade-offs. And finally, forest, if managed in the right way, may aid public health and kind of a health promoting environment, and could mitigate some of those disservices. So what comes next? I think biodiversity is certainly important for health. We need certainly more research into those complex interactions between biodiversity, health. Just think about zoonosis. I think the concept of experienced and perceived diversity is interesting to follow up. And in the end, it's about the quantification of the nature dose you need to see some health effects at the public and the population level. Of course, this could have some implications for urban and forest planning. So if you think about management of parks, street trees, gardens, forests, it's not only about biodiversity, it's also about health. And maybe you have heard about these healing forests or healthscape designs, where people actually already now try to combine different aspects of the environment and to manage them, to design them, to create a healthy environment. And that could also be related to forests. And of course, at the political and civil society level, it would be nice that kind of using these synergies between promoting biodiversity and health effects in both international, national, or local policy objectives. Yeah, with that, I would like to finish. I would like to thank you and Biodiversa and all these national funding agencies for the support. And if you want, you can also look at our 3 minutes video. You can find it on our homepage, but you can also find it by scanning this QR code. And with that, I would like to finish, and I'm happy to get some questions. And if you want to know more about all these things, this is the first current list of our publications. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Michel. Thank you for a great talk. So we've got a bit of time for questions. I can see there are already questions. And let me just get it so that I can see it. Okay. From Cindy Prescott, she asks, regarding positive effects of perceived biodiversity on mental health, how much is this a real effect of diversity or based on an assumption by the person that biodiversity is good? And therefore, I think if I see more biodiversity, then it must be good. So I feel better. Very good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, thank you, Cindy. Yes and no. Maybe if you're actually, presumably you're right, that people, at least some people might have that expectation. So if it's diverse, it's better for me. But if they think actually better, then this is already one of those health effects that we measure with these standardized questionnaires, which have been done by the psychologist in our group. And interestingly, it has been supported by these physiological measures. So they also measured brain activity. They also measured hormone levels in saliva. And so even using these more kind of hard traits or hard measures, you still can see those effects. But as I showed you, the perceived diversity effect, still there's a huge variability. The effect itself is relatively small. And if you use just the measured levels of biodiversity, we, at least in this study, haven't found huge effects of tree species richness. So yes, and how big this effect actually is, yeah, I'm not the psychologist to answer that, but I think there's certainly some truth in it.
So then the next one is from Paul Rogers, which is I'm curious about PM 2.5 and geographic proximity to higher biodiversity forests. Wouldn't these forests naturally be farther from the source of air pollution? And conversely, how can we make higher diversity forests nearer to urban areas or pollution sources?
Mm. Maybe Doug, you're the person to answer that.
I'm not answering that.
So from my perspective, I mean, in this study, actually, this study was done in these tree diversity experiments. So actually, we had at the same site with the same overall pollution levels, the low, mid, and high diversity communities. So in that case, we had no, confounding between high diversity forests being far away and plantations, monocultures near the cities. So in these studies, we hadn't had this problem, but overall, I tend to agree that there might be this difference between more natural forest being, well, maybe not necessarily, depending on where you are in which country. Maybe I don't know if you want to comment yourself on it, whether you.
If I can say, it's certainly better in terms of parks to have diverse parks than non-diverse parks, for example. And certainly, once you get to urban problems, it gets trickier. What trees you really want to have, because actually the trees that absorb a lot of particulate, people don't like them as far as urban trees. That's the problem. So,
Yeah,
but I'm happy to talk to Paul about
yeah,
that. That needs some
yeah.
explanation. So the next one is from. Did you think about chemical diversity component like volatiles,
Yeah,
a forest bath?
yeah. Actually, we discussed that when we developed the proposal, and at that state, we decided not to include it. We now have a study also in one of the tree diversity experiments. So we did one study here in Freiburg, where we analyzed the volatile composition of those different communities, to have not only studying the soundscapes as we did, but also the smellscapes. Actually, what we saw is that you have a huge effect of the presence of conifers. If you have conifers in a stand, your volatile profile is completely different than in broadleaf forest, and that's we know that you can smell it. I don't know of any study that actually looked at the chemodiversity effect and whether this has effects on that on those observations that some of those volatiles can suppress immune or can support immune system responses in humans. There are these studies on these forest bathing, as you say, community. Um, uh, but as far as I know, it's more about, the presence or absence of certain volatiles. I don't know whether there's a study actually looking on chemodiversity, which would be certainly very interesting. Yes.
Okay, the next one again is a follow-up from Cindy, which is would a very interesting study, would this be a good argument for planting hyper-diverse Miyawaki forests in urban areas? I hope I said that
Yeah,
correctly.
the famous Miyawaki forest, these little tiny forests that people plant mostly in urban areas, and which have been shown to be very attractive to people. So people like them. They go to these little mini forests in urban areas. I know here, for example, Germany, there's a company that sells to cities those little forests and plant them. And I would say yes, why not? One of the main outcomes of this Dr. Forest project was that even though the effects were relatively small, they were always positive, and not negative in the sense that more diverse would have a negative effect on one of those outcomes. We had these negative effects of canopy density, as I said, on medicinal plants and also on ticks. But the diversity effect, and you were asking about hyperdiverse Miyawaki forests, I would say at least it will not reduce any health effects. Yeah, that maybe is would be one aspect.
Okay, another question from Simone Maru, which is I'll shorten it a bit. These data are very interesting for urban green planning. And in that context, a question is often the patch size. Did you consider it in the analysis? For example, could the negative interaction between cooling effect and ticks vary with patch size?
So the first answer is no. We have not included patch size in our analysis. The second answer would be the forest stands we analyzed for the microclimatic effect and also for the ticks in the natural forest. I would say they were large enough so that they showed the typical inner forest microclimate. The patches of the tree diversity, and you know that, Simone, you have your own one, actually sometimes are relatively small. And the typical forest inner forest microclimate, at least at the patch level, is not always present. So I would say yes, for the tree diversity experiments, I would actually expect an effect of the patch size. So that you have, lower cooling in smaller patches and so on and so forth, which is maybe more relevant if you think about small forest remnants in a rather agricultural landscape. And for example, here in Central Europe, we often have the situation that in a matrix of agricultural landscape, we have little forest patches left of different sizes. And actually, we also did a study in this kind of design where it compared, forest structures and diversity in those little forest patches. And of course, there's a strong correlation between patch size, forest structure, forest diversity, which then should also cascade down to ecosystem services and health outcomes. So just by analogy, I would say, yes, having larger forests around urban areas would actually presumably increase those potential health benefits.
Super. Great.
Thank you. I didn't understand we could actually talk, so I wrote. But thank you, Mika. I just realized it now. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you here.
Okay, that looks like it's. Yeah, I have a quick question to more or less end. Do you think with the perceived relationship, the relationship between perceived biodiversity and mental health would still hold if those people knew that biodiversity was increasing the number of ticks?
First, in our case, the number was reduced in more diverse systems. So actually, in that case, they would think, oh, forest is even better because there are fewer ticks. But of course, the knowledge of people on what is going on in a forest presumably has big effects in these kind of psychological investigations. That case, again, you would have to ask the colleagues from psychology how to, make these strong interferences from these data. Anyhow, what we did, a little side experiment was we had a similar study here in Freiburg with students from different faculties. So we had different acoustically diverse recordings, and they were listening to those recordings. And the students were either coming from the faculty of biology, chemistry, or social sciences. So our idea was that maybe biologists, because they know more about forests and ecology, would have would show stronger effects of those different acoustic recordings on their mental well-being, but actually we didn't found those differences. So all of the students, they reacted rather similarly, and indeed kind of what also interesting for temperate sounds, the more diverse sounds were more relaxing. But we also played them tropical sounds, so from tropical rainforest, and the more complex tropical sounds were actually more kind of creating anxious, how you pronounce that? Anxiety and kind of fear, because obviously for our temperate students, the tropical sounds were kind of, that is something, not so used, not so known, and then the stress level was rather going higher than lower. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, okay, thank you very much for a great talk. So again, there's nothing left for me to say that the next talk will be on the 5th of February, and it will be Pauline Grierson, and she's going to talk about karri forests in Australia. So a happy end of the year, Christmas, whatever you do, and see you next year. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.